correct. It's right. This is how they would act and function and think and do. So this is unique. This is really interesting. When we get some light on understanding Laman and Lemuel, we can also be illuminated as to some of the religious conflict that runs throughout the entire Book of Mormon. I suggest, rather than seeing the conflict as stemming exclusively from Laman and Lemuel's stubborn and rebellious natures, Lehi's family may be a microcosm of the conflict in Jerusalem between those who espouse Josiah's Deuteronomic reforms and the pre-reform religion. So when we look at Lehi's theology, what do we find? In the first chapter that I've explained, we see that he had affinities with the older religion. Lehi did. What if Laman and Lemuel were actual believers in Josiah's reform? Very interesting. Now, what this does for us is we know that Laman and Lemuel were fond of Jerusalem. Oh, and they mention it many times in the record. I mean, their hearts were just constantly at Jerusalem, no matter how far out through the wilderness they got. Even on into the New World, they complained that they should have never left Jerusalem. Once they had all those miracles performed and they crossed the ocean, they still wanted to be in Jerusalem. So this is interesting. What if they were believers in Josiah's reform? Perhaps that fondness of Jerusalem extended to accepting and supporting the reforms, including the centralizing both of the political and the religious power in Jerusalem. Suppose that these beliefs constituted a firm faith, and that they saw Lehi as stubbornly espousing parts of their religion that they sincerely believed needed reformed. That is why they could be complaining so heavily against Lehi. Not because they were doubters, but because they were believers, just in another faith. Very interesting, isn't it? I've never quite looked at this that way. It's very interesting. They would certainly, and naturally, despise Lehi's visions if they were believers in the reforms, because the reformers got rid of the visions. They got rid of the old religion of the council of the gods and visions. Very interesting. They got rid of the idea that man could become deified with God. Those visions contained theological concepts that they felt needed to be, quote, modernized, unquote. That's why they murmur against Lehi. Isn't that fascinating? Well, those beliefs would have included Lehi's faith in the atoning Messiah. Now understand, that's not part of the reform of Josiah. That's part of the older religion. It would have included a concept the reformers excised from the religion. Conflict over the identity and nature of the Messiah became the focus of the religious debates in the New World. And when you run across several of the prominent apostates, Sherem, Korihor, Nehor, all of those, the argument is what kind of a Messiah? The Book of Mormon reflects the older pre-reformed Messiah as an atoning one. Isn't this fascinating? Now, if Laman and Lemuel were actually believers rather than apostates, then it is their belief in contrast to the atoning Messiah that explains how this particular conflict crosses the ocean. And this conflict actually becomes the major theme of religious conflict in the entire history of the Book of Mormon. We know Laman and Lemuel taught their children that the Nephites wronged them. That is where the hatred of the Lamanites came from against the Nephites in the New World. It says it several times as various groups of Nephites go mingling and get caught by the Lamanites and they're put into bondage by them. Limhi's party, Zeniff's party, so on and so forth. That's why Abinadi came and prophesied against King Noah and in his discussion of the law of Moses, he included the atoning Messiah. He quoted Isaiah 53, interestingly enough. So now things begin to gel a little bit with this basis of understanding. And Brandt acknowledges, he said, I'm speculating here. But it gives it it puts the heart into the Lamanite dissension against the Nephite religion. They're believers, just in a different religion. Very interesting. It's a religious conflict. This is how the Book of Mormon shows this. The speculation about Laman and Lemuel's beliefs has some support in research about personality formation in the ancient world. Molina and Neri remind us that the idea of individualism is a modern one. We don't find a lot of individualism in the Book of Mormon and the Nephite record. Now, we do in the Book of Ether. We have the singular superhero, the brother of Jared, for instance. So, and it's a different record from a completely different time with completely different people. It's very interesting, isn't it? But within the Nephite world, from 600 BC on, we get this theme of in the ancient world, personalities were more group-oriented. And this derived from shared traditions, with particularly from geographical locations. So Laman and Lemuel identify with the group of Jerusalem, you see. They don't identify with the group of Lehi. They identify with that group in Jerusalem, a Jerusalem that had very recently been religiously transformed. Their personal association with that city and with its ruling elite would plausibly make them believers, but believers in a different religion from Lehi's, rather than simply being non-believers. Non-believers wouldn't have fought against Lehi and Nephi the way a true believer in a different religion would. So this builds up. It's a beautiful insight, I think, with what Gardner is saying. Now, Laman and Lemuel were Hebrews. We have to understand that. I'm on page 93 of Gardner's commentary now. They were Hebrews. They must have believed in something Hebrew. And if they did believe in the Reform, in contrast to Lehi's belief in elements of the pre-Reform religion, then this hypothesis explains their role in the Book of Mormon in a way that accounts for more tensions between the Nephites and the Lamanites than any other explanation. And that's why I think there's merit here. This makes beautiful sense. I will use this assumption as a working framework precisely because it is so productive in explaining the New World religious tensions. And it is. It's beautiful how he discovers this. Laman and Lemuel are definitely presented as villains in the Book of Mormon record. But to their credit, now this was a good insight too. To their credit, they did demonstrate filial obedience to their father, even though they may have had significant, and given the religious climate in Jerusalem, actually significant and legitimate religious differences. They did have filial allegiance to Lehi. Their behavior thus shows a strong sense of moral responsibility that, despite their disbelief, carries them to the New World and lasts until their father dies. There's the key. With the dissolution of the family, Laman and Lemuel would see themselves as simply claiming their birthright as the eldest sons. And of course, their willingness to turn to violence means that their evil reputation is not wholly undeserved either. But we've given them kind of a bad rap in some respects that takes away the further meaning throughout the Book of Mormon record. With this foundation,